The sun was sinking low behind the ridgeline when Calder Boone reined in his weary horse, the faint sound of scraping carrying on the wind, a hollow, desperate rhythm that did not belong in this lonely stretch of prairie. He slid silently from the saddle, his boots sinking into the dry earth, and followed the noise through a stand of twisted cottonwoods until the trees opened into a clearing. There, on his knees in the hard ground, a boy no older than 9 clawed at the dirt with a rusted shovel, his ribs jutting sharp beneath a filthy shirt, his face streaked with sweat and grime. Calder's breath caught at the sight. The hole was already waist-deep, shaped with the precision of a grave. The boy's thin arms shook violently, his breaths coming in ragged gasps as if each scoop of earth might be his last. Calder's voice, rough from disuse, came low and steady, asking what in God's name he was doing out here alone. The boy startled, dropping the shovel and scrambling back, his eyes wide and wild like a cornered animal. Calder raised his hands slowly to show he meant no harm, but the boy only shook his head, clutching a small wooden horse in one dirt-streaked hand while his lips moved soundlessly. Calder crouched beside the grave, scanning the ground for signs of danger, his instincts prickling like spurs against skin. There were no tracks leading away, no sign of anyone else, only the boy and his frantic digging. Finally, the child's cracked voice emerged, no louder than a whisper, saying the grave wasn't ready yet. Not ready because they said if it wasn't done before sundown, she would never come home. Calder's gut went cold, a heavy weight sinking through him as he stared into the boy's hollow eyes and asked who he meant. The boy clutched the wooden horse tighter, tears cutting streaks through the dirt on his face, and whispered a single word that made Calder's blood run colder than the approaching night. Sister. Calder's heart hammered in his chest as the boy's trembling whisper echoed in the gathering dusk, a single fragile word heavy with terror and love. Sister. The boy's knees buckled, and he fell forward, clutching at Calder's coat as if the sheer act of holding on might keep the world from collapsing, his filthy fingers digging into the worn fabric while he sobbed soundlessly for a moment before forcing words past cracked lips. "They took her," he rasped, his voice breaking. "They said I had to dig the hole or they'd put her in it alive when the sun goes down." Calder's jaw clenched, his storm-gray eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. Every muscle tight with fury, knowing there were tracks somewhere nearby, knowing outlaws had left this child here to suffer, a cruel game meant to break him. The boy tried to rise, staggered, and would have fallen again if Calder hadn't caught him beneath the arms, holding him upright with a gentleness that belied his rugged frame. "What's your name, son?" Calder asked, his voice calm, though rage coiled beneath it like a rattler ready to strike. "Micah," the boy choked out, his gaze darting toward the deepening shadows of the canyon beyond. Calder lifted the wooden horse from Micah's trembling hand, turning it over in his calloused palm. Noting the crude carving and the initials HR burned into its side, a child's beloved toy, and a clue. "That hers?" Calder asked, and Micah nodded fiercely, tears shining in his hollow eyes. "Hannah," he whispered, "my little sister. She's all I got left since Ma and Pa died last winter." Calder's throat tightened, memories of his own buried family clawing at him, but he forced them down, focusing on the boy, on the terror trembling in his voice. "How many men?" Calder asked, and Micah swallowed hard, holding up 3 shaking fingers before collapsing into Calder's chest, sobbing that they'd promised to let her go if the grave was ready. But he knew they were lying. He knew they just wanted him to dig it so he'd suffer twice. Calder gathered the boy into his arms, his expression carved from stone as he rose and carried Micah to his horse. "We'll finish this hole their way," he muttered darkly. "Then we'll make them dig their own." As he swung into the saddle with Micah clutched close, The last rays of sunlight bled red across the sky, and somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled, as if warning that a storm of blood and vengeance was riding fast into the night. Calder rode hard through the night, his jaw locked and his body low over the saddle. Micah clinging to his waist with the limp strength of exhaustion, while the horse's hooves thundered across the open range. The boy's breathing was ragged, his tiny frame shaking from hunger and terror, but he didn't cry out even once, as if some part of him knew silence was his only shield against the darkness stalking them. When they reached a dry creek bed, Calder dismounted and crouched low, studying the ground by moonlight. There, boot prints, 3 distinct sets, heavy and careless, heading east toward the black teeth of the canyon. He tied the horse to a mesquite tree and knelt beside Micah, his voice soft but urgent, asking him to tell everything from the start, no matter how much it hurt. Micah clutched the wooden horse to his chest and stared into the shadows as if replaying every nightmare he'd endured. His words came halting at first, then faster, spilling out like water from a cracked dam. After their parents died of fever, he and Hannah had lived alone in their family's crumbling cabin, surviving on scraps and hope. 3 days ago, riders appeared at dusk, men with cruel smiles and whiskey breath, led by a scar-faced brute named Silas Rudd. They said the cabin sat on land Silas wanted for himself, a hidden trail leading to outlaw gold. When Micah begged them to leave, Silas only laughed and seized Hannah, telling Micah to dig a grave before sunset or watch his sister buried alive. They tied Hannah to a post, left Micah with the shovel, and promised to return when the sky turned red. Micah's voice cracked as he described Hannah's screams fading into the distance, his own desperate digging fueled by terror and helpless rage. Calder's hands curled into fists, the old ghosts of his past whispering. He knew Silas Rudd, had once ridden with him in his reckless youth before turning away from that life. He had thought Silas dead or gone, but now here he was, still poisoning the land like a rattlesnake that refused to die. Calder forced his fury into focus, resting a steadying hand on Micah's thin shoulder. "You did good, boy," he murmured. "No shame in what you've endured. I'll bring her back, I swear it." Micah's tear-streaked face lifted, a flicker of hope igniting in his hollow eyes. Calder rose, checking his revolver and rifle, then untied the horse and boosted Micah back into the saddle. As they followed the trail into the canyon, the air grew colder, the rocks looming like silent judges. Calder's mind churned with plans and memories, every step of his horse bringing him closer to a reckoning he'd long delayed. Ahead, a faint light glimmered, a campfire, voices carried on the wind, cruel laughter mingling with Hannah's muffled cries. Calder halted, his hand raised, and Micah froze, his tiny body rigid with fear and hope. Calder crouched beside him, whispering that the next steps would be silent and sure, like hunting wolves in the dark. He pressed the wooden horse back into Micah's hand, a promise that Hannah would hold it again before dawn. As the first hint of dawn painted the canyon rim in blood-red light, Calder's storm-gray eyes hardened. Tonight, Silas Rudd would face the quiet cowboy he had once underestimated, and the grave he'd demanded would be filled, but not with the child he'd meant to bury. The first streaks of dawn clawed across the canyon walls as Calder crouched behind a boulder, the chill air biting at his skin while Micah trembled beside him, clutching the wooden horse so tightly his knuckles turned white. Below, the outlaws' camp sprawled like a nest of vipers, 3 horses tied to a fallen tree, a crooked fire burning low beside a crude shelter made of tarps and branches. Hannah was there, her small form bound to a wagon wheel, head slumped forward, a rag gagging her mouth. Calder's jaw tightened, his storm-gray eyes sweeping the camp with the cold precision of a hawk hunting its prey. Silas Rudd sat nearest the fire, his scarred face half lit by the flames, two men beside him cleaning rifles and laughing about the hole the brat must have dug by now. Calder's chest burned with rage, but he forced his breathing slow, knowing one reckless move could cost all their lives. He whispered to Micah, voice barely audible over the wind, telling him to stay hidden no matter what happened, to hold on to the wooden horse and not look back. Micah shook his head violently, tears streaking his dirty cheeks, whispering hoarsely that he wanted to help. Calder cupped the boy's face, his rough hands surprisingly gentle, and told him that helping meant surviving and carrying Hannah home once Calder made sure it was safe. Sliding through the rocks like a shadow, Calder crept closer to the camp, every footstep silent, every movement controlled. Silas shifted suddenly, his head turning as if sensing the ghost of his old riding partner in the pre-dawn mist. Calder froze, crouched low, listening to the men's banter turn to argument. One outlaw muttered about leaving town before daylight, while another scoffed, saying Silas was wasting time scaring a couple of kids instead of robbing the stagecoach they'd planned to hit. Silas silenced them with a single glare, his voice cold and cruel as he declared that fear was a weapon sharper than any knife, and by sundown, the boy's heart would be broken and the land would be theirs. That was the moment Calder struck. He moved like a rattlesnake, lunging from cover with his revolver drawn, dropping the first outlaw before the man could even shout. The second reached for his rifle, but Calder's boot smashed into his chest, sending him sprawling backward into the fire. Silas spun, his scarred face twisting with recognition and hatred. "Boone," he snarled, the name a curse in his mouth. "Thought you were dead or gutless enough to stay gone." Calder's voice was flat and deadly, no louder than the wind. "You should have stayed in the hole you crawled from, Silas." Their eyes locked, a history of betrayal and blood between them, before Silas dove behind the wagon, firing wildly. Calder returned fire, bullets sparking against the canyon walls, while Hannah's terrified, muffled cries rose above the chaos. Micah, unable to stay hidden, burst from the rocks and scrambled toward his sister. Calder shouted for him to stop, but it was too late. Silas saw the movement and swung his gun toward the boy. Time slowed, Calder's heart lurching as he dove between them, a shot ringing out. Micah screamed, clutching the wooden horse as he fell beside his sister, while Calder rolled to his feet, pain burning through his side where the bullet grazed him. Silas laughed darkly, retreating deeper into the canyon with the last outlaw limping behind him, shouting that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Calder gathered Hannah and Micah close, his voice hoarse but steady, as he swore that Silas would never take another step free. But in his gut, he knew this battle was only beginning, and the grave they'd left behind might still be needed before the sun set again. Calder half-carried, half-dragged Hannah and Micah to the cover of the canyon wall, his breath ragged and his shirt sticky with blood from the grazing wound on his side, though he ignored the pain, as if it were no more than a mosquito bite. Hannah clung weakly to his neck, her small body trembling, while Micah clutched the wooden horse so tightly the edges cut into his palms, his wide eyes never leaving the path where Silas had disappeared. The sky above darkened as heavy clouds gathered, the kind that brought sudden violent storms to the canyon lands, a fitting backdrop for the reckoning that brewed in Calder's heart. He crouched in the shadows, listening intently to the echo of retreating hoofbeats, knowing Silas hadn't run far. Men like him didn't retreat, unless they had a trap waiting. Calder's mind worked quickly, his old outlaw instincts whispering that Silas would circle back to strike when they were weakest. Hannah whimpered, and Calder gently removed the gag, his voice low and soothing as he promised her she was safe now, though he knew safety was a lie until Silas was in the ground. Micah clutched his sister fiercely, tears mixing with dirt on his thin face as he swore he'd never let her out of his sight again. Calder knelt before them, his storm-gray eyes softening for a brief heartbeat. "You've both been through hell," he murmured, "but I need you strong a little longer. There's a rancher named Jonah 2 miles east. If anything happens to me, ride there and tell him Boone sent you." Micah shook his head violently, his voice cracking as he cried that he wouldn't leave Calder, that he wanted to fight too. Calder gripped the boy's shoulders firmly, not unkindly. "You already fought harder than most men ever will. Now let me finish this." Thunder rumbled, closer now, and a sudden gust of wind stirred the canyon dust into swirling ghosts. Calder led them toward a narrow pass. Every step deliberate, his senses sharp. As they emerged onto a rocky ledge, the trap was sprung. Silas's mocking laugh echoed from the cliffs above, and rifle fire exploded in the still air. Calder shoved Hannah and Micah behind a boulder, rolling as bullets sparked off the stone. The last remaining outlaw appeared from the ridge, blocking their escape route, his gun leveled at Micah. Calder's revolver barked, the man falling backward into the storm just as Silas emerged from the shadows, his scarred face a mask of rage. "You think you can take what's mine, Boone?" Silas shouted over the wind, his voice raw with fury. "That land, those kids, even your own past, you left it all for me to claim." Calder's reply was cold as the rain that began to fall, a slow, steady drizzle that turned the rocks slick beneath their boots. "I left that life because it rotted everything it touched," he growled, "but you followed me like a sickness. Tonight it ends." They circled each other, lightning flashing overhead, their shapes stark and primal in the storm's light. Micah's small hand gripped Hannah's as they huddled behind the rock, the boy whispering prayers he barely remembered. Silas lunged first, firing wildly. Calder returned fire, each shot precise, forcing Silas backward toward the edge of the canyon. A misstep, a splash of rain, and suddenly Silas was teetering on the brink, his eyes wide with hate and fear. But before Calder could finish it, a crack of thunder masked a second shot, Silas's bullet striking Calder in the shoulder. Pain roared through him as he fell to one knee, and Silas advanced with a triumphant snarl, ready to end it. Micah screamed, and Hannah clutched the wooden horse, their terror feeding Calder's strength as he raised his head, storm-gray eyes blazing, prepared to fight even if it cost him everything. Rain poured in sheets, blurring the canyon into a gray nightmare as Calder forced himself to his feet, his wounded shoulder screaming with every breath while Silas stalked forward with murder burning in his scarred face. Micah's scream echoed over the thunder, raw with terror and rage, spurring Calder's body into motion despite the pain. Silas laughed, a sound colder than the storm, mocking the boy for thinking a man like Boone could ever save them. "You dig a grave for me, boy, and you dig another for him," Silas bellowed, the wind whipping his words across the rocks. Micah clutched Hannah tightly, his thin frame shaking, the wooden horse trapped between their chests like a talisman of hope. Calder's storm-gray eyes narrowed as he stepped between the children and their tormentor, his voice low and deadly, carried by the gale. "This grave won't hold them, Silas. It's waiting for you." Silas snarled and lunged, their bodies colliding with a brutal crash that sent them both sprawling in the mud. The revolver skittered across the slick stone, lost to the rain. Calder's fists met Silas's jaw, a savage rhythm of old grudges and new fury, but Silas fought like a cornered wolf, gouging and biting, desperate to reclaim control. Lightning split the sky, illuminating Micah's terrified face as he scrambled forward, desperate to help. Calder roared for him to stay back, but Silas used the distraction, ramming his knee into Calder's injured shoulder and forcing him onto his back, hands closing around his throat. For a heartbeat, everything narrowed to the sound of Hannah's muffled sobs, and Micah's hoarse plea for Calder not to die. Calder's vision darkened, the storm fading into memories. His own brother buried in a shallow grave years ago. A life of violence he'd tried to escape, but never could. With a final surge of will, he wrenched free, twisting Silas's arm until a sickening crack filled the canyon. Silas screamed, staggering back, clutching his broken limb, but his eyes still burned with hate. He stumbled toward the ledge, knife flashing in his other hand, shrieking that if he went down, he'd take one of the kids with him. Micah's face went pale as Silas lunged, but Calder was faster, hurling himself forward and driving his shoulder into Silas's chest. The knife spun into the storm as Silas teetered on the brink, his boots scrabbling for purchase before he toppled into the raging river below, his final scream swallowed by the thunder. The storm seemed to exhale, its fury easing as the rain slowed to a steady drizzle. Calder sagged to his knees, chest heaving, the wound in his shoulder burning like fire. Micah rushed to him, sobbing into his chest, while Hannah clung to her brother, the wooden horse pressed between their shaking hands. Calder wrapped his arms around them both, his voice ragged but fierce. "You're safe now. No more graves. Not for you." Micah hiccuped, tears mixing with rain, and whispered that he'd thought the grave he dug was meant for Hannah. Calder met his gaze, voice steady despite the ache in his body. "It was never hers, Micah. It was Silas's all along." As dawn finally broke, painting the canyon gold and crimson, Calder guided the children toward the trail home. Behind them, the half-dug grave stood waiting, but instead of death, it now promised rebirth. Micah paused, dropped to his knees, and began to fill it with wildflowers, his sister's small hand steadying his own. Calder watched silently, his hat low over his eyes, knowing the boy's final act turned a place of despair into a symbol of hope. With Silas gone and the past finally buried, they rode toward the rising sun, a quiet cowboy, two brave children, and a future no storm could ever steal again. The storm had passed, leaving the land scrubbed clean beneath the pale wash of dawn, every droplet on the canyon rocks glimmering like tiny stars. Calder rode slowly, his body stiff with pain, but his arms steady as he held Hannah in front of him, Micah riding behind with his small hands clutching Calder's belt. The children were silent now, not from fear, but from exhaustion, their faces streaked with mud and tears, their eyes haunted yet alive. As they crested the last ridge, the clearing where Micah had dug the grave came into view. The hole gaped dark and raw in the soft morning light, a wound in the earth, the shovel still lying crooked beside it. Calder's jaw tightened, a flash of rage and sorrow cutting through his usually calm expression. He slowed the horse and dismounted carefully, setting Hannah gently on the ground. Micah slid off next, his legs trembling beneath him, the wooden horse clutched so tightly in his hand that his knuckles were white. He stared at the grave with wide, wet eyes, his breath hitching as memories of the terror Silas had inflicted came flooding back. Calder knelt beside him, resting one steady hand on the boy's thin shoulder. "This grave was never meant for your sister," Calder said quietly, his voice rough but certain. "It's a place where fear was planted. Now we'll decide what grows there instead." Micah sniffled, blinking up at him. "What can grow in a hole like that?" Calder's storm-gray eyes softened, their usual steel melting into something gentler. "Whatever you choose, boy, you can leave it empty and let the darkness come back, or you can fill it with something that proves you beat it." Micah swallowed hard, then nodded, determination slowly straightening his spine. He turned and ran into the meadow, tearing handfuls of wildflowers from the wet earth, yellow, white, and violet blooms, their fragile petals shining in the light. Hannah followed, laughing weakly for the first time since her rescue, her voice like a bird's fragile song. Together they knelt at the edge of the grave, dropping the flowers inside until the dark soil was hidden beneath a blanket of color. Calder watched silently, his hat shadowing his face, pride and grief warring in his chest. As the children worked, Jonah, the rancher Calder trusted, rode into the clearing with a pair of ranch hands, their expressions a mix of relief and worry. Word had spread about Silas's gang, and Jonah had come ready to fight, only to find the storm's aftermath and the silent proof of victory. He helped Calder bind his shoulder properly, his voice low with admiration. "You saved them, Boone," he said. Calder shook his head slowly. "They saved themselves. I just gave them the chance." When the last flower was placed, Micah stood, holding the wooden horse high like a banner. "This was hers once," he said, his voice trembling but strong. "Now it belongs to both of us." Calder knelt, gripping the boy's shoulders firmly. "That grave doesn't own you anymore. You own your story now." Micah nodded fiercely, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked cheeks, and placed the wooden horse gently atop the bed of flowers. The morning sun caught the toy's worn surface, making it shine as if lit from within. As they mounted up to ride toward Jonah's ranch, Calder cast one last look back at the transformed grave. What had begun as a symbol of despair now bloomed with fragile beauty, proof that even the darkest night could yield to dawn. With Micah and Hannah safe, and the shadow of Silas finally buried, Calder turned his face to the horizon, a quiet cowboy ready to guard this fragile hope with his life. The ride back to Jonah's ranch was slow and heavy, the horse's hooves squelching softly in the damp earth left by the storm. Calder rode in silence, his jaw set, every muscle aching from the fight with Silas, but he kept his back straight so Micah and Hannah would not see his pain. The children rode double behind him, Micah holding Hannah protectively, his small face hardened by everything he had endured. Calder's storm-gray eyes scanned the horizon constantly, wary of trouble even though Silas was gone. Men like him left scars that didn't fade easily, and Calder knew others might rise to take his place. When the ranch finally appeared, its weathered fences stretching like open arms, Jonah and two ranch hands rushed out to meet them. Jonah's face broke into a relieved grin as he lifted Hannah from the saddle and swung her high into the air, her startled laugh breaking the somber mood like a crack of sunlight. Micah slid down next, clutching the wooden horse tightly, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of safety for the first time in days. Calder dismounted last, his boots sinking into the soft mud, and handed Jonah a brief nod of thanks. Jonah clapped his shoulder, only to freeze when he felt the soaked, warm fabric of Calder's shirt and realized how badly he was hurt. "You're bleeding more than you're letting on, Boone," Jonah growled, but Calder brushed him off with his usual quiet stubbornness. "Not till they're settled," he said, jerking his chin toward the children. Inside the ranch house, Hannah was given warm blankets and broth while Jonah's wife, Martha, tended to her gently. Micah refused to let go of Calder's side, even as Martha urged him to rest. Finally, Calder knelt so they were eye to eye. "You're safe here," he said softly. "Jonah's a good man. He'll keep you both safe if anything happens to me." Micah's eyes filled with tears, his voice shaking. "You're not leaving us, are you?" Calder hesitated, his heart twisting. "I'm not leaving," he promised. "But there are still men out there who followed Silas, and they'll want revenge. If I don't deal with them, they'll come for you and Hannah." Later that night, when the children were asleep by the fire, Jonah poured Calder a cup of strong coffee and sat across from him. "You could stay," Jonah said. "Raise them here. Teach Micah to ride. Give him a chance to heal." Calder stared into the flames, the light reflecting off the hard lines of his face. "I'd like nothing more," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know the kind of men Silas ran with. They won't forgive this. And I won't have that boy dig another grave because of me." Jonah's hand tightened on his mug. "Then I'm riding with you," he said firmly. Calder gave a rare, brief smile. "Reckon I'll need a man I can trust at my back." As dawn crept through the windows, Micah stirred in his sleep, clutching the wooden horse. Calder stood in the doorway, watching him with an expression that was both fierce and tender. He whispered a vow to the rising sun that no harm would ever come to these children again, not while he drew breath. Outside, the wind carried faint echoes from the canyon. As if the land itself remembered Silas's screams and promised it would never forget the night a quiet cowboy turned a grave into a garden of wildflowers. With a final glance back, Calder mounted his horse, Jonah beside him, and together they rode toward the horizon, ready to face the ghosts of the past so the children would never have to. The morning light painted the prairie in hues of gold and rust as Calder and Jonah rode hard across the open range, their silhouettes stark against the rising sun. Calder's jaw was tight, his injured shoulder bound beneath his coat, but his storm-gray eyes were sharp, scanning every ridge and shadow. He knew Silas's men would not scatter like frightened coyotes. They'd gather, hungry for revenge, and strike back at the children who had escaped their cruelty. Behind them, the faint shape of Jonah's ranch faded into the horizon, a safe haven Calder swore would remain untouched no matter the cost. Jonah glanced sideways, his face grim beneath his hat. "You think they know Silas is dead?" Calder's voice was low, edged with certainty. "Men like that feel when their leader falls. Fear keeps them together, but rage drives them after blood." By noon, they reached the old stagecoach trail, where fresh hoofprints cut deep into the mud from the storm. Calder dismounted, crouching to study the tracks, his fingers brushing the wet earth. 4 horses, riding heavy and fast, heading north. Jonah's brows knitted, 4 against 2. Calder's lips curved in the faintest ghost of a smile. "Odds haven't stopped me before." They mounted again, pushing their horses to a gallop, the wind tearing past them as storm clouds gathered once more, the land mirroring the violence brewing ahead. As dusk approached, they spotted smoke rising from a hollow in the hills. Calder signaled Jonah to dismount, and together they crept through the scrub until the outlaws' camp came into view. 4 men lounged around a fire, their laughter cruel, their voices carrying through the still air. Calder's stomach twisted when he heard Micah's name on their lips, the men joking about how much gold Silas had hidden and how easy it would be to snatch the children again to lure Calder back. Jonah's hand clenched his rifle, but Calder motioned him to wait. "Not yet. We need to end this clean." They split, circling the camp like wolves. Calder moved silent as shadow, his revolver steady in his hand. Lightning flashed in the distance, throwing stark light across the clearing. One outlaw looked up just in time to see Calder emerge from the dark, his storm-gray eyes like steel. The man reached for his gun, but Calder's shot struck first, dropping him before he could cry out. Chaos erupted. Jonah fired from the opposite side, hitting another outlaw square in the chest. The remaining 2 scrambled for cover, shouting Silas's name as if calling him back from the grave. Calder advanced through the smoke and fire, his voice cold as the canyon wind. "Silas is gone. You'll join him if you take another step toward those children." One outlaw charged, blade raised, and Calder met him head-on, their bodies colliding in a brutal clash. Pain seared through Calder's injured shoulder, but he twisted, driving the man into the ground and ending it with a single, final shot. The last outlaw froze, dropping his weapon, his hands trembling as he begged for mercy. Calder's finger hovered over the trigger, memories of Micah digging that terrible grave flashing through his mind. Jonah's voice cut through the storm. "Boone, don't let him walk away, not after what they've done." Calder's gaze burned, but instead of killing, he struck the man unconscious with the butt of his revolver. "Justice, not vengeance," he growled. "We'll take him back to stand trial." As the storm broke overhead, Calder and Jonah tied the outlaw and gathered the stolen gold Silas had hoarded, ensuring his evil legacy would be turned to good. Calder looked north toward Jonah's ranch, knowing Micah and Hannah waited there, unaware of how close danger had crept again. Come dawn, Calder swore silently, this trail of blood would end forever. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe in a future where children could grow up free from graves and guns. The storm faded into a soft drizzle by dawn, washing the blood and smoke from the earth as Calder and Jonah rode slowly back toward Jonah's ranch. The captured outlaw slumped across Jonah's horse like a broken rag doll. Calder's body throbbed with pain from his shoulder wound and the bruises Silas had left behind, but his mind stayed razor sharp, every sense alert as they neared the homestead. The wooden fences came into view first, then the thin trail of chimney smoke curling peacefully into the morning sky. Relief flickered briefly in Calder's storm-gray eyes, but it was tempered by wariness. He knew evil didn't always announce itself with gunfire. It could hide in whispers and shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. Micah was the first to spot them, his small figure darting onto the porch, Hannah clutching his hand as she peered out with wide eyes. Micah's cry of joy carried across the yard, breaking into sobs as Calder swung down from the saddle. The boy ran to him, throwing his arms around Calder's waist, clutching the rough fabric of his coat as if to anchor himself to safety. Calder knelt carefully, wincing, and embraced both children, the wooden horse caught between them like a promise fulfilled. "It's done," he said softly, his deep voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Silas's men won't harm you ever again." Hannah buried her face against his neck, her muffled thanks warming the cold edges of his heart. Jonah dismounted and dragged the outlaw toward the barn, declaring he would send for the marshal to take the man away and see justice done properly. Inside the warm glow of the ranch house, Martha wept openly as she tended to Calder's wounds, scolding him for risking his life while silently grateful he had returned. Micah hovered nearby, silent for once, his small hands clasped tightly. When Calder caught his gaze, he reached out and set a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. "You were brave beyond your years," Calder said quietly. "But you don't have to fight anymore. This place is yours now, yours and Hannah's." Micah's lip trembled as he whispered that he'd thought the grave he dug would be Hannah's, and then maybe his too. Calder's eyes softened, his voice fierce but gentle. "That grave is filled with wildflowers now, and that's all it'll ever hold." Later, as evening fell, the whole town gathered at Jonah's ranch. Word of Silas's crimes had spread like wildfire, and neighbors came bringing food, blankets, and promises of protection. Calder stood apart from the crowd, hat brim low, his quiet presence commanding respect without a single word. Jonah stepped forward, raising his voice to declare that Silas's reign of terror was over, because one man had stood between innocence and evil. The people cheered, their voices rising in a chorus that seemed to cleanse the land itself. When night deepened and the last lanterns were extinguished, Calder walked alone to the clearing where the half-dug grave remained. Under the silver light of the moon, he saw the blanket of wildflowers Micah and Hannah had planted, their colors vivid even in the darkness. He knelt, removing his hat, and whispered a vow only the earth could hear, that he would live not for vengeance, but for the future of the children who had trusted him with their lives. As he rose, a soft laugh drifted from the cabin, Hannah's laughter mixing with Micah's excited chatter. Proof that life had begun again. Calder mounted his horse, watching the horizon with calm, steady eyes. The quiet cowboy had no need for words. His oath was etched in every breath he drew, and every step he took to keep the graves of the past filled only with flowers. Never again with broken dreams.